everyone, and welcome to Retail Reset, a curated virtual forum for retail executives. Our goal is to provide tailored and tactical conversations and content to help you map your road to recovery and beyond. I'm Brian Wassel, Associate Editor at Retail Touchpoints, and I'm thrilled to be joined by Barbara Connors, Vice President, Grocery Merchandising Consulting at 8451. We're going to be talking about how Barbara and Kroger are helping grocers and shoppers respond to the COVID-19 crisis, how the company has adjusted operations during this unprecedented time. So welcome, Barbara. Thank you for joining us for this discussion.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Great. Yeah, I'd like to start off just by asking you, can you tell me a little bit about how this pandemic has affected your operations? In particular, what's the current state of the grocery industry as a whole?
Yeah, so the disruption that's been created by COVID-19 is both widespread and unprecedented. We are really in the midst of a massive worldwide event that is fundamentally changing business. At a minimum, the impact that it has will last for the next several months, and it has the potential to create some really lasting change as well. So the grocery industry as a whole is experiencing unprecedented demand, first and foremost. And we're seeing that really driven by two key factors so far. So first, the pandemic caused panic buying when it first started. And that was sort of similar to the effect that we see ahead of natural disasters like a snowstorm or a hurricane. We also then saw shelter-in-place orders and business closings that forced people to shift away from dining outside of the home and back to the dining room table. Secondly, we also have seen that the crisis has shifted how and when people buy their groceries. E-commerce has grown as people have sought to avoid contact with others. And we're also seeing shifts towards increased purchasing behavior during the middle of the week as people are changing up their weekly routines. So it's really the combination of these things that has affected really every aspect of grocery, from operations to merchandising, all the way through to marketing.
Okay, so it sounds like the whole world has been changing, the whole industry. So can you tell me a little bit about how these global conditions have manifested in Kroger's day-to-day and some of the changes that you're noticing?
Sure. So some of the changes that we're seeing at Kroger are similar to what we're seeing at the industry level. I'll talk about four key things that are impacting us. So one is demand, as I mentioned before, from customers. The second is just the pace of change that we're experiencing. The third is really around supply chain constraint. And the fourth is on shifting customer priorities. So if we start with demand. So I mentioned that one of the impacts that the pandemic is creating is just astronomical increase in customer demand. We saw this happen really pretty immediately after the World Health Organization officially named COVID-19 a pandemic. Customers began stocking up on some of the key categories that we expect as you prepare for a natural disaster. So bath tissue, water, paper towels, soap. But we also saw a large spike in stock up behavior on health scare items. So think household cleaning, cold and flu, vitamins, analgesics. And as soon as we were wrapping sort of our heads around responding to that first spike, dynamics shifted again. So the pace of change was really quick. As schools and daycares closed, as companies began sending employees home, we saw a shift in that sort of stock up behavior to now include things like meat, coffee, frozen pizza. We saw a lot of purchases of wine as customers and people were preparing to spend more time at home. And what's really interesting is that over the last 10 weeks or so, we've seen multiple phases as customer behavior has shifted. It's sort of migrated from this initial health scare, stock up, panic buying mode into more of a stock up for preparing for kids to be home and no longer being in school and working from home throughout the day. We saw that then sort of migrate into preparing for an extended time at home as sort of shelter in place orders were really solidified. We've also experienced during this time people celebrating a lot of holidays at home. We've had Easter, Passover, and Ramadan all occur during these shelter-in-place times. And And we've also seen customers sort of start to adjust to what a new normal, if you can call that, would look like. And then as soon as you start talking about what a new normal would look like, we're now sort of shifting into this time where we're all cautiously watching as states issue some of those reopenings and thinking about what that means for perhaps a new kind of summer this year, and what that also means for big milestones yet to occur throughout the remainder of this year as we think about different holidays and even back to school in the next few months. All of this, as sort of you think about these shifts, is creating a lot of constraint on supply chain. So we really see constraints on supply chain happening sort of from two different sort of big macro levels. One is the increased demand. So that is creating very real constraints on supply chain. The other is the very real impact that COVID is having on people. So we're also seeing constraints caused by cases of COVID that are emerging at companies that operate across the supply chain. And these two big factors are creating a domino effect on one another that really sort of is creating an additional constraint. So I'll illustrate with two different examples that are both having impact on frozen foods. So on one end of the spectrum, I've talked about sort of this panic, stock up, pantry loading behavior. One key category that's being impacted by this is canned vegetables. And as people are buying up canned vegetables, it's creating constraint on supply and has created out of stocks in store in that aisle. As customers are experiencing those out of stocks, we're seeing them move into the frozen aisle to then buy frozen vegetables. On the other end of the spectrum, if we think about meat, we all know that there have been significant outbreaks of COVID in meat packing plants that's causing constraint on fresh meat. That also is causing customers to then look for different alternatives in the frozen aisle to buy meat. And so both of these things are creating additional constraint on frozen foods that didn't initially, with the crisis, exist. And so all of this sort of culminates together, as I mentioned before, around shifting customer priorities. What we have seen over the last several weeks is that what matters most to customers is really changing. And product and traditional brand loyalty isn't as important in an environment where you have highly constrained supply. As a result, we're seeing customers willing to shift not only items, but brands, and in some cases categories, to actually buy the fundamental product that they're looking for to fill their need.
Interesting. Yeah, I got to say, that really reflects what I'm seeing as a shopper myself. So what has 8451 in particular been doing to respond to these changing consumer trends and needs?
Yeah, so if we think back to our purpose, at Kroger, our purpose is to feed the human spirit. And at 8451, our purpose is to make people's lives easier. So if we think about what's sort of shifting from a customer mindset and behavior right now, we're seeing them make fewer trips to the store, and they're stocking up on more when they go. And they really depend on Kroger to have the products that they need to feed their families and stay healthy while they're staying at home. And so what we're doing at 8451 is helping Kroger deliver on that need by adapting the analytics that we provide, the marketing that we plan and execute, and the partnership strategy that we implement so that we can expedite the insights to action during this ever-changing environment. As we think through sort of how we're doing this and how this comes to life, I think speed really comes to mind in terms of a key change that we've implemented, data triangulation, and just that strategic alignment across insights and activation. From a speed standpoint, we've shifted the frequency with which we do different analytics. There are some analytics that we previously would have done on a weekly cadence that's now moving to daily. So think about that as being potentially some inventory reporting. And then there's also analysis that we would have been doing in a normal environment on a monthly standpoint that's now shifting to weekly. And so some of that would be examples like monitoring customer sentiment. I mentioned data triangulation. In addition to changing the speed and cadence with which we do analysis, we're also pulling information from many more different sources than we ever have before, and stitching that together with our traditional shopper data so that we can make smart decisions for our customers. So some examples of that are looking at health data. So we're tracking where COVID cases are emerging across the country. We're looking at economic data, so looking at unemployment, SNAP benefits and changes in government announcements. We're looking at government issuances of shelter-in-place orders, restaurant closings, business closings, restrictions on mass gatherings, and then now on the flip side, watching those same government orders around lifting some of those restrictions. And then I also mentioned sentiment. So we are pulling together more and more information around customer motivations, anxiety, anticipation of future needs, and connecting that with purchase behavior so that we're able to really provide that holistic view of how all of these different socio-macroeconomic impacts are really driving what is most important to our customers right now. And then sort of I mentioned that we do this to bring strategic alignment across insights and activation. That's really the core of what we do at any time. But we feel a strong sense of responsibility, right, to help Kroger and our CPG partners leverage the spectrum of assets available across insights and activation in a unified and seamless way so that you can deliver for your customers. So one example of how we're doing this is we've mapped categories sort of against different customer activation pillars based on how the categories are responding to the COVID crisis. Because the strategy that we implement against a category that's seeing significantly high growth in households is very different than the strategy that we would implement against categories that are seeing a negative impact from COVID. And it's important that we're really connecting the dots across all the different data points together to quickly help Kroger and CPG partners act in a really unified and seamless way for those customers.
Okay. And what data have you been able to collect that's provided the most guidance for your decision making?
So I talked a minute ago about speed. And what we've learned is that there's different data that is really critical when you're making some of those really quick decisions versus some of those sort of macro changes. So when we think about data that we are reporting on a daily basis, that's really looking at like inventory data by commodity, by brand, by product, and connecting that and bringing together CPGs, merchandising, supply chain, and procurement all together so that on a daily basis, they can really prioritize where the biggest opportunities are to dig in. As we think about more on like a weekly cadence, that's where we have stood up new sentiment reporting. So we have a weekly pulse that we track with customers to understand how their feelings and motivations and what they're seeking from Kroger. Because this allows us to then prioritize our work against what is most important to them. And by having that weekly cadence, we can also then pivot our priorities at the pace with which their needs are changing. And then when you take a little bit of a further step back, so you think about sort of multi-week analysis, that's where we're really taking advantage of the breadth and granularity of data that we have and the sophistication with data science to bring together all those different purchasing dynamics at a really quick pace. So by looking at a total store lens, but also digging deep into how customer baskets and trips are changing, and we're able to identify spikes early There might be a short-term change in customer behavior that we want to react to quickly, but then also identify some of those emerging trends that we anticipate are going to be around for a more sustained period of time. Example of that would be home cooking. So we're seeing that as shelter-in-place orders were issued and people are spending more and more time at home and staying at home longer, they are having a rebirth, if you will, of home baking and home cooking, and we're really seeing those category trends reflect that across the store.
Okay, so it sounds like there's a lot of changes. You're processing a lot of data very quickly. Have you altered your processes to make necessary adjustments to operating during the time of COVID-19?
Yeah, so just as COVID has disrupted customers' lives, it's also disrupted our work. So we've seen, as I talked about, different phases of customer behavior over time. We've also experienced different phases in sort of how we've worked and approached different analytics and processes to respond. So it's sort of evolved in the beginning to like an immediately a scramble to provide quick analysis to spikes. We then sort of pivot to like quick and dirty analysis. We reallocated resources to stand up new processes. And where we're at now is thinking about how those processes that were stood up can evolve for more sustained engagement. Some examples of this would include more frequent meetings that we've stood up, centralized and more frequent communication, and like many companies and like this interview, we are embracing teleconferencing as all of our employees have started to work from home en masse.
Yeah, especially with regards to teleconferencing, there's just a lot. I guess it's a different way of doing communication now than in the past. And so, what kind of changes have you made to help you, facilitate internal collaboration between all of your working parts?
Sure, I'd say hallmarks have been transparency, centralization, and frequency. One example of this is that at the beginning of the crisis, we made a strategic decision at 8451 to push out a centralized message from our company to our CPG partners with customer trends that we're seeing across the total store, our priorities, and asks that we have of them from a partnership standpoint. And the purpose in doing this was to really quickly ensure that everyone we were working with had similar awareness of the customer behaviors that were driving the decisions that we were making, and also enabled us to springboard conversations around rapid collaboration on data-driven solutions. So that's just one example, but it does a good job of sort of combining how centralized communication and providing that on an ongoing basis has, in our experience, helped to speed up collaboration and ensure that everyone is really quickly working from sort of the same level set information.
Yeah, actually, I'd like to bring up something that you mentioned a bit earlier in the interview, which is that you've seen a lot of disruption in the production and supply chain that's affecting the availability of different products, from fresh produce to frozen meat. What are some of the steps you've taken to address this issue?
So one of our top priorities is ensuring that our customers can find the products they are looking for at our stores. And so one of the first asks that we had of CPGs, and it was in that communication that I referenced, was for them to be really transparent with us around the constraints that they were going to have in supply chain, because this would enable us to very quickly partner together to identify the best available items that we could get to shelf and get it where it was needed most. We're also reacting really quickly to changing capacity and production priorities from CPG partners. Where we would typically only sort of touch or reset a shelf 1 to 2 times a year. We have altered that process and set up new processes that enable us to make changes when it's warranted. So this includes removing items from the shelf that we know CPGs won't be able to produce for an extended period of time, and then bringing them back to shelf when they are available again. And it also includes us shifting sort of what the shelf looks like to reflect the items that CPGs are producing and supplying. Some key categories that are experiencing significant growth and are in high demand are areas where we're setting up new vendors and products to quickly get sort of new items on shelf to replace some of the disruption that's being caused by items that can't come. So one sort of very specific example is in food service. We are setting up new relationships and products from food service companies that would have previously been supplying those items to restaurants. We're also setting up many new vendors in some key categories like hand sanitizer that are just experiencing significant disruption in supply.
So with all these changes and what's available, what CPGs can actually produce, what have you done to evolve your analysis to make sense of both what's happening now and what you expect to see down the road?
Yeah, so as the crisis has evolved, and its impact has grown, the analysis required to answer those different business questions has had to evolve with it. In the very beginning, our focus was on speed, granularity, and really looking at category and geographic trends. We closely analyzed trends that we're seeing in the West to help predict and anticipate the spread of COVID across the country and what other divisions we're going to soon need. And we also stood up daily supply chain reporting that I mentioned earlier to help teams very quickly be able to prioritize and hone in on key opportunities. As shelter-in-place orders were issued, we then realized that some macro-level customer trends were likely going to follow. And so we shifted our analysis focus to really apply a cross-category view and a macro lens so that we could tease out and pick up early some of those behavioral and lifestyle shifts. One of the really interesting things about this time period is that we've seen that shifts that happen in a single week can actually signal a trend. So I mentioned before sort of a resurgence in home cooking and home baking. We saw in really 1 week that trend pick up with key categories like yeast and flour as customers started to bake breads from scratch at home and sort of reacquaint themselves with some baking and cookbooks that maybe they hadn't touched in a while. We also, over time, have seen that the crisis has impacted different customers in different ways. So we then sort of shifted from looking at cross-category to now taking it a double click below and saying, well, what is really the impact that we're seeing across customers, across income? What is the difference that we're seeing across different generations and in age groups? How are we seeing trends change across households with kids versus those that don't have kids? So that we can not only decompose those trends, but really so that we can understand what those needs are and respond to them. And now, as states are starting to issue some of those reopenings, we're sort of going through this cycle all over again to watch and analyze at a category level and at a division or a state level what trends emerged during COVID that we may see now shift again as a result of restaurants opening back up and shelter-in-place orders being lifted.
Yeah, and based on what I've seen, I feel like even as stores reopen and restaurants reopen, we're going to get back to something closer to normal. It's going to be what I keep hearing called the new normal. Yep. So I guess what are some of the ways that 8451 and Kroger are preparing to help both customers, brands, and employees get ready for this new normal?
So I think you You actually mentioned it really well. So as we think about the new normal and what this disruption has caused, it's going to have an impact across our lives as people and as customers, our stores, the industry as a whole, and how we work. So for us, it all starts with the customer. So we have an opportunity to help people thrive in this new reality. And thrive through holidays and summer, and returning to school in the fall. And so as we think about it, the food that we sell and the meal solutions that we provide are opportunities for us to help customers feed their families on potentially newly constrained budgets, and to find moments of celebration, of discovery, and uplift in new environments, be them a little bit more sheltered now and starting to open up potentially into smaller gatherings as people adjust to maybe a new normal as things lift. But that can only happen if we make our stores easy for customers to shop. And so our focus as we think about store disruption is really making sure that we are continuing to do everything we can to keep our shelves stocked, keep them clean, and organized, so that customers can quickly and safely find what they need. We're also thinking about this more than ever from an omni-channel perspective, and connecting in-store experience to online as e-commerce has continued to grow. As we think about sort of industry new normals, one of the results of this disruption is that people are buying new categories they never bought before. They're trying new brands they never bought before, and also trying new items for the first time. So from a CPG industry perspective, we have a really unique opportunity to help brands connect with customers in a new way and provide relevant communication and incentives to drive brand loyalty with a whole new growing customer base. And then from a work disruption standpoint, I would say that as probably many companies are experiencing, in the middle of that disruption, we don't know yet what processes that we've created and ways of working shifts that we've implemented will continue, and which will continue to evolve. Really what we are focused on right now is doing everything that we can to deliver for our customers. And we are committed to continuing to evolve our ways of working and processes as our customer needs evolve.
Okay. So yeah, it sounds like you really are doing a good job of navigating through the COVID-19 pandemic, and preparing yourself and your customer and your workers to deal with what's happening. With that in mind, can you give some advice for other retailers who are also navigating and what they can do to just get through these uncertain times?
Sure. And thank you. I'd say first and foremost, it's a balance. So I'd say manage for today while also planning for the future, and expect that things will continue to change. So some changes are going to last for a discrete, albeit sort of longer period of time than we would like. And some changes will be permanent. We don't know exactly which changes are going to fall into each of those camps, but it's really critical that as we are solving for customer needs today and this week, we're continuing to keep an eye on the future, because they depend on us to plan ahead for summer, or back to school, for holidays as we move into the fall. So as sort of you're thinking about that, be really deliberate as much as you can around the way that you set up new processes and evolve analytics and ways of working, so that you're thinking about how those changes could potentially be changes that you implement long term. However, as sort of you're doing that, don't be afraid to make quick decisions. So if there is a decision that you need to make, but you don't have sort of a full future-proof process, don't be afraid to act quickly. One of the things we've learned throughout this crisis is that speed is really critical. So if you stall or delay, you lose valuable time. And really the last thing I would say sort of in closing is just to make sure that you're focusing on the customer and do what you do best to serve them. Purpose matters more now than ever. I mentioned earlier that at Kroger, our purpose is to feed the human spirit. At 8451, our purpose is to make people's lives easier. And it is really the union of these two things that drives everything that we are doing for our associates, for our partners across the supply chain, and for our customers. So my ultimate advice to other retailers and partners in the industry is just to determine what it is that will unify your company and everyone that you work with across your strategic partnership set to collectively deliver for your customers and their evolving needs during this unprecedented time.
Awesome. Well, Barbara, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
And also like to thank everyone else for listening in.